By the middle of August 1944, the finest army Germany still had in the West was dying in a bowl of Norman farmland barely 15 miles across. Two whole armies, the German 7th and the 5th Panzer, the spearhead divisions that had held the Allies off the invasion beaches for 10 weeks, were being crushed from three sides at once. The roads out were jammed with tanks that would never fire another shell. The fields were on fire, and the men who would crawl out the far end would carry nothing but the rifles slung on their backs. In 10 days, the war in the West stopped being a battle and became a slaughter. The Germans had a name for the ground they had to cross to escape it. They called it the Corridor of Death. This is the story of how Hitler's army in France was destroyed, not pushed back, not simply outmaneuvered, destroyed as a fighting force in a sack of burning countryside between two small towns most people have never heard of. To understand how two entire armies ended up trapped in a pocket the size of a single county, you have to go back to the hedgerows and to a German high command that could no longer tell the truth to itself. For most of the summer, the Germans had actually been winning the kind of fight they wanted. Normandy was hedgerow country, a maze of high earth banks and sunken lanes where a single machine gun could hold up a whole battalion. The German soldier dug into those banks, bled the Allies for every field, and made them pay in a currency of dead infantry. By late July, the front had barely crawled forward. The Americans were stuck short of a town called Saint-Lô. Around the city of Caen, where the British and Canadians fought, the German panzer divisions stood like a wall and would not break. But a wall only works if the men behind it can still move. And on the 25th of July, the Americans stopped trying to lean on the wall and decided to blow a hole straight through it. They called it Operation Cobra. West of Saint-Lô, hundreds of heavy bombers were brought in to carpet a narrow strip of German line with high explosive until the defenders inside it simply ceased to exist as a unit. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of the strongest armoured formations in Normandy, was sitting in that strip. It was, in a single morning, all but buried. Then the American First Army, under General Omar Bradley, drove its tanks and infantry into the gap the bombers had opened. For the first day or two, the Germans still thought they could plug it. They could not. Within 72 hours, the German left flank in Normandy had no bottom to it anymore. There was just open road running south and then east, and the Americans were already on it, moving faster than the German command could redraw its maps. And then it got far worse for the Germans, because on the 1st of August, the Allies turned a breakout into a stampede. That was the day General George Patton's Third Army went live. Patton did not think the way the German generals expected an enemy to think. He did not care about clearing ground field by careful field. He cared about speed, about throwing armoured columns so deep into the German rear that no one could build a new line in front of them. His tanks swung west into Brittany, then wheeled hard back to the east, racing across open country with their own flanks hanging wide open, daring the Germans to do something about it. And the Germans did almost nothing, because the German command was staring in the wrong direction entirely. Here is where the trap began to take shape, and the terrible thing is that the Germans helped build it with their own hands. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge commanded Army Group B, the formation that held the entire German front in Normandy. Von Kluge was not a fool. He could read the American breakout for exactly what it was. The sane move, the move that nearly every senior German officer in Normandy privately wanted, was to pull the 7th Army and the Panzer divisions back toward the east at once, behind a river, before the open flank swallowed them whole. Trade ground for survival. Get the army out while there was still a road to leave on. But the order that came down from Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia said the opposite of survival. It said attack, drive west, cut the Americans off at the root. On the 7th of August, the Germans obeyed and launched Operation Lüttich. The plan was to gather the panzer divisions, turn them around to face west, and ram them through the narrow neck of the American breakout at a town called Mortain, sealing Patton's columns off behind them. On a situation map 1,000 miles from the front, it looked daring. On the actual ground, it was a sentence of death. It drove the strongest divisions the Germans had left even deeper to the west, even farther from the only safe exit, at the exact moment the Allies were curling around behind them on both wings. The attack at Mortain came apart almost as soon as it began. American infantry held the high ground above the town, a feature the maps called Hill 314, and they would not be moved. Men of the American 30th Infantry Division, cut off and surrounded on that hill, called artillery fire down onto the German columns trying to push past them, and simply refused to break. And above the whole battlefield, in clear August weather, the Allied fighter bombers came. They fell on the German tank columns out in the open and tore them to pieces, one armoured vehicle at a time. The panzers that were supposed to win the war in the west spent themselves against a hill they never took, in a town they never held. That single decision, the order to attack at Mortain instead of pulling back, is the hinge on which everything else turns. The Germans had just shoved their best remaining troops as far as physically possible into the mouth of a sack the Allies were about to draw shut behind them. Because while the panzers were burning at Mortain, the jaws of the trap were already swinging close to the north and the south. To the north, the 1st Canadian Army, under General Harry Crerar, launched Operation Totalize on the night of the 7th of August, driving hard down the main road toward the town of Falaise. This was a new kind of attack for the Allies, armoured columns rolling forward in the dark to get past the German anti-tank guns before dawn. To the south, Patton's Americans were sweeping up from the opposite direction, aiming for a town called Argentan. Lay a map flat, and the geometry is brutally simple. 2 Allied pincers, one coming down from the north, one coming up from the south, reaching for each other. And caught in the shrinking space between them, 2 German armies, much of their strength still pointing the wrong way, still trying to fight the battle at Mortain that was already lost. The distance between Falaise and Argentan, the open mouth of the sack, was only about 15 miles. Close that mouth, and everything inside it was finished. Now here is the part of the story that still starts arguments among historians more than 80 years later. The Allies very nearly failed to close it. By the 13th of August, Patton's leading corps had fought its way up to Argentan from the south. The northern jaw was still grinding down toward Falaise, slowed by German rear guards who fought from every ridge and tree line. Patton wanted to keep driving north, past Argentan, and slam the gap shut himself with his own tanks. And General Bradley ordered him to stop where he was. The reasons were tangled and have been argued ever since. There was real fear of 2 Allied armies, one driving north, one driving south, crashing headlong into each other in the smoke and confusion and shooting up their own men. There was fear that a thin American spearhead pushed too far ahead might be overrun by a German army fighting for its very life. So the southern jaw halted at Argentan, and the gap between the pincers stayed open. A corridor, perhaps 15 miles across at first, and through that corridor the trapped Germans could still see the one thing that mattered to them now, a way out to the east. For the ordinary German soldier inside the pocket, that open gap was the whole difference between a prison camp and a grave. And so, in their tens of thousands, they began to run for it. If this is the kind of history you came here for, the battles that actually broke the German army, rather than the ones everyone already knows by heart, take a second to subscribe. There is a great deal more of it coming, and it is exactly this granular. So, picture the ground now from inside the pocket, in the heat of mid-August. Tens of thousands of German troops, the survivors of 14 or 15 battered divisions, crammed into a steadily shrinking patch of farmland and orchard and narrow lane. Tanks low on fuel, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, because much of the German army still moved by horse, half-tracks, towed guns, ambulances, field kitchens. The entire physical body of 2 armies, all of it funneling toward one narrowing exit in the east. And above all of it, from first light to last, the sky belonged completely to the Allies. Every road was watched from the air. Every column that dared to move in daylight became a target the moment it was seen. The men inside began calling that eastern exit by a single grim phrase that has stuck to the place ever since: the corridor of death. This is where the killing turned into something close to industrial work. Allied artillery had every road ranged in advance. Observers up on the surrounding high ground watched the packed columns crawl forward and called the shell fire down onto them. And the shells walked slowly up and down lines of vehicles that had nowhere to turn off and nowhere to hide. And from above came the fighter bombers again, the British Typhoons and the American fighters, diving on anything that moved. The pilots learned to hit the lead vehicles of a column and then the rearmost vehicles, boxing everything in between so that the whole trapped mass of metal in the middle simply sat on the road and burned where it stood. The little Dives River cut across part of the escape line, and its handful of small stone bridges and shallow fords became choke points where the whole retreat backed up nose to tail. Vehicles jammed solid for hundreds of yards. Men gave up on the trucks, climbed down, and waded the river on foot under the shell bursts. Afterward, the crossings were described as choked with the dead, with shattered wagons, with the swollen bodies of horses, the entire broken machinery of an army piled up at the water's edge. One Allied officer who walked that ground when the guns went quiet said you could travel for hundreds of yards across the wreckage by stepping only on dead men, dead horses, and twisted metal, and never once put a boot on open earth. That is what the inside of the pocket had become by the third week of August. Not a battlefield, a killing ground with one narrow door. And still the Germans fought, with real and stubborn courage, to keep that door from closing. Because a door that shuts traps everyone left on the wrong side of it. On the 14th of August, the Canadians renewed their drive with Operation Tractable, grinding out the last few miles down to Falaise itself. The town fell on the 16th and 17th, cleared in hard street fighting by the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. The northern jaw was almost all the way down now. The mouth of the pocket was squeezing tighter by the hour, from 15 miles across to 10, from 10 to just a handful. It was in exactly these days that the German command cracked at the very top, with the worst possible timing. On the 17th of August, Field Marshal von Kluge, who had spent the whole battle crushed between an impossible order from above and an impossible reality in front of him, was relieved of command of Army Group B. In his place came Field Marshal Walter Model, a hard man with a reputation for dragging shattered fronts back from the brink. Von Kluge set out on the long road back toward Germany. He never reached it. Somewhere along that road, knowing he was already suspected of disloyalty to Hitler and that worse was waiting for him at home, he took his own life with poison. Sit with what that means for the men in the field. The army group was changing commanders at the precise hour its two armies were being strangled in the bottom of the pocket. The soldiers dying in the corridor of death did not even have a steady hand at the very top while they died. And in the end, the fight to keep that corridor open came down to a single ridge, and to a few hundred men who were not German, and not French, and not American, but Polish. The ridge was called Mont Ormel, marked on the Allied maps as Hill 262. It rose above the last stretch of open ground on the escape route, and whoever held the top of it could look straight down onto the very roads the Germans needed to live. On the 19th of August, the Polish 1st Armoured Division, under General Stanislaw Maciek, fought its way up onto that high ground from the direction of the village of Chambois, and dug in to stay. Maciek studied the shape of the ridge on his map, and thought it looked like a heavy wooden club with two swollen heads. His men gave it a name in their own language, the Machuga, the Mace. And the Mace was now a blade laid flat against the throat of two German armies. From the crest of Hill 262, the Polish gunners and tank crews brought fire down onto the German columns, inching through the gap below them. They could see almost everything, and almost everything they could see, they wrecked. For the trapped Germans, that ridge was the cork jammed into the neck of the bottle. As long as the Poles held the top of it, The escape corridor was a shooting gallery with the Poles standing over it. So the Germans did the only thing left to do. They came at the ridge from both sides at once, and they came with everything they had. This is the part of the whole battle that even the men who lived through it could barely find words for afterward. Roughly 1,500 Polish soldiers held the heights. From inside the pocket, German units, frantic to break out, threw themselves at the Poles, trying to punch a hole clean through the position. And from outside the pocket, driving inward, came the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, fighting to smash the Poles off the ridge altogether and tear the escape road back open for their trapped comrades. The Poles were caught between two German forces, surrounded on their own hilltop, and they were running low on ammunition, low on fuel, low on water, low on everything a man needs to keep fighting. For 2 full days, through the 19th, the 20th, and into the 21st of August, they held. They beat back attack after attack after attack. Their wounded stacked up in the aid posts with no clear way to get them out. Their dead lay where they had fallen on the slope. At the worst moments, the SS tanks pushed in so close that the fighting was almost muzzle against muzzle. And still, the Poles would not surrender the high ground, and still, the guns up on the Mace kept falling on the German columns trying to flee below them. Down in the corridor itself, other German units fought their own savage little battles to keep a path alive a few hours longer. Around the village of Saint-Lambert, near the Dives, German armour, including elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, fought to hold a narrow corridor open for a few hours, just long enough for some thousands more men to slip out on foot before the way was finally choked shut behind them. And some did get out. This is the truth that sits underneath the whole story, and it matters that we get it exactly right. The pocket was a catastrophe for the German army, the worst it had suffered in the West, but it was not a perfectly sealed tomb. Through that narrow, burning corridor, before the Poles on the Mace and the Canadians in the Gap finally closed it for good, somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 German troops escaped to the east. The estimates spread that wide because no one on either side was truly counting in the middle of that chaos. But look closely at what escaped and at what stayed behind. The men who got out as fugitives, not as soldiers in a fighting line. They left the army itself lying behind them in the fields. The tanks were abandoned on the roads, out of fuel, broken down, or burning where they stopped. The assault guns, the towed artillery, the half-tracks, the trucks, the radios, the workshops, the entire mechanical body of 2 great armies, all of it stayed inside the pocket. A soldier who walks out carrying only his rifle and the dust on his uniform is a living man. He is not an army. And it was the army that died at Falaise, not most of the men. On the evening of the 21st of August, the pocket was sealed for good. The Poles still held the Mace, hollowed out but unbroken. The Canadians and the Americans had finally shaken hands across the closing gap near Chambois. The corridor of death was shut. When it was over, men walked across that ground and tried to count what had been left there, and the figures barely fit inside the mind. Of the 80,000 to 100,000 Germans caught inside the pocket, somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 lay dead. Another 40,000 to 50,000 were prisoners, marched away in long grey columns into captivity. In the northern sector alone, the Allies counted 252 guns and nearly 2,500 vehicles destroyed or simply abandoned where they stood. Across the whole pocket, investigators later put the loss at around 500 tanks and assault guns. On the slopes of Hill 262, where the Poles had held against everything, the ground was carpeted with German dead, thousands more taken prisoner, and dozens of tanks left as burned-out scrap. Take the German divisions one at a time, and the picture is the same wherever you look. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the formation built around the Hitler Youth, had gone into the Normandy fighting more than 20,000 strong. By the 22nd of August, it could put barely 8,000 men into the field, and it had left almost every tank and gun it owned behind in the pocket. That was no longer a division. That was a casualty list with a name on it. Even the army's own commanders had only just escaped with their lives. SS General Paul Hauser, who led the 7th Army, was carried out of the pocket half-conscious, with a bullet wound clean through his jaw, dragged clear by his own men. The general got out. The army he commanded did not. And that is the real meaning of those 10 days in August. With the pocket sealed, the striking power of Army Group B in the west was simply gone. The 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army still existed as names on a map, as headquarters tents with staff officers shuffling paper. But the divisions underneath those proud names had been gutted down to splinters. There was no coherent German line left anywhere between the invasion beaches and the German border. There was no force in all of France with the strength to stop what came next. What came next was a collapse. With the army that had defended France destroyed in the field, the Allies did not so much advance as flood forward across the country. They raced for the River Seine, and on the 25th of August, only 4 days after the pocket was closed, Paris was liberated. The city the Germans had occupied for 4 years fell almost without a fight, because the army that might have stood and defended it was lying dead and broken in the fields around Falaise. Go back one last time to that bowl of farmland 15 miles across. For 10 long weeks, the German soldier had held the line in Normandy with a skill and a stubbornness that cost the Allies dearly in blood for every hedgerow. He was not beaten because he was outfought field for field. He was beaten because his own high command marched him into a sack and then ordered him to attack westward while the neck of that sack was being tied shut behind him. The courage of the men was real to the very end. The judgment at the top was a catastrophe, and the bill for that catastrophe was paid, in full, by 2 armies in a corridor they themselves named for death. The men who escaped lived to fight again, on other rivers, along the German frontier, through the last cold winter of the war. But the Army of the West, the one that had met the invasion on the beaches and held it back all summer long, that army ended here. It died on the roads, under the Polish guns on the Mace, in the choked and bloody crossings of the Dives, and it never came back. If you want to follow the men who clawed their way out of that pocket and see the wall they tried to throw up on Germany's own border to stop the flood, that story is waiting for you next. Subscribe, and let us follow the German army all the way to the bitter end.